Imagine waking up not to the sound of an alarm, but to the distant crowing of a rooster, the creak of wood as the wind shifts your cottage walls, and the chill of the damp morning air pressing in. There's no time to stretch or snooze, because your day has already begun. You are a peasant in medieval Europe, somewhere between the 9th and 14th century. You don't own the land you work on. You barely own the tools you use. But the survival of your family, your village, and the very system that rules over you all depend on your labor.
The majority of people in medieval Europe, over 90%, were peasants. They were the farmers, laborers, shepherds, and cotters who formed the backbone of society. But don't be fooled by the word peasant. It wasn't a single class, there were layers. At the top were freeholders, peasants who actually owned a small piece of land. Then there were freemen, or villeins, who paid rent to farmland owned by the local lord. And at the bottom were serfs, bound to the land and unable to leave without permission. In some places the lines were blurry, but one thing was clear: all of them worked hard, very hard. A typical day began before sunrise. You'd wake up on a straw mattress, often shared with your spouse and children, maybe even some chickens if you were lucky, or unlucky. The home was one room, no chimney. Smoke from the hearth drifted up through a hole in the thatch. If it rained, you hoped the roof didn't leak. There were no light switches. You'd fumble in the dark, maybe light a tallow candle if you could afford one, but most likely, you'd move by memory. A quick splash of cold water to the face, if any. No soap, no toothpaste, no time. You grabbed a bit of hard bread or yesterday's pottage and got to work. If it was spring, you were tilling the soil. If it was summer, you were weeding and tending. If it was autumn, it was harvest time, the most exhausting season of all. And if it was winter, you still worked. You gathered firewood, tended animals, repaired tools, or helped with communal projects like bridge repairs or fence building. Your workday could easily stretch 12 hours or more, dictated by the sun, and all of it was done manually. Plows pulled by oxen, harvesting with a sickle. Everything slow, physical, and repetitive. Injuries were common, and there was no workers' compensation. But the work wasn't just on your own small strip of land. Much of your time was spent on domain work, labor for your lord's estate. You were required to tend his crops before your own. You might also be called upon to help build a wall, dig ditches, or grind grain at his mill, for a fee, of course. Despite this, there was pride in your labor. Skills were passed down through generations, knowing when to plant, how to rotate crops, how to predict the weather by watching the sky. It wasn't written science, but it was knowledge, honed over centuries. And yet, food was never guaranteed. The average peasant diet was monotonous but filling when there was enough to go around. The staple was pottage, a thick, boiling stew made from peas, beans, oats, and whatever vegetables were in season. You ate it with coarse bread made from rye or barley. Wheat bread? That was for the nobility. Meat was rare. A chicken on a feast day, maybe some bacon if your pig survived the winter. Fish, if you lived near a stream. And forget forks. You ate with a wooden spoon, or your hands. Meals were communal, often eaten seated on the ground and always centered around the hearth. Leftovers went to the animals, unless there weren't any. Water was unsafe in many places, so ale, weak and homemade, was the go-to drink. It wasn't about getting drunk, it was about staying alive. Inside the home, things were cramped. A single room with dirt floors, walls made from sticks and mud, wattle and daub. If you were fortunate, a raised sleeping area. If not, the floor was your bed. There was no privacy, no bathroom. Waste went in a pit outside, or sometimes in a bucket. Most families had multiple children, not just for love, but for labor. The more hands, the better.
Boys helped in the fields, girls learned to cook, spin, weave, and care for animals. By the age of 12, you were considered old enough to marry or work independently. Religion played a massive role in your daily rhythm. The church wasn't just a place to worship, it was the center of your world. You were expected to attend Mass weekly, often more. You paid tithes, 10% of your crops or income, to the church, even if you barely had enough to eat. But religion also offered hope. Saints were prayed to for healthy harvests. Candles were lit to keep away disease. And while priests held power, many peasants clung to a mix of faith and folklore, believing in charms, omens, and ancient rituals passed down quietly beneath the shadow of the cross. Justice? That was local and rarely fair. If you stole a loaf of bread, the punishment might be a public flogging or a steep fine you couldn't afford. If you broke curfew or failed to meet your work duties, you could be punished by your lord's steward. The system was designed to keep you in your place. But life wasn't all misery. On holy days and feast days, and there were many, you rested. There were celebrations for saints, harvest festivals, and wedding gatherings. These were times for music, dancing, storytelling, and laughter. You might play a game of ball in the field, or watch a traveling troupe of performers. Community was everything. You depended on your neighbors, for help, for trade, for protection. When someone fell ill, others stepped in. When a roof needed mending, the village helped. You may have had little, but you weren't alone. Still, death was always near. Life expectancy hovered around 35, but that number was dragged down by high infant mortality. If you made it past childhood, you had a decent chance of living into your 50s. But disease, injury, famine, and childbirth claimed many. There were no doctors, only wise women, herbalists, and the prayers of the devout.
They survived plagues, wars, taxation, drought. They built Europe's farms, fed its armies, and sustained its castles. While history often remembers kings and knights, it was the peasants who kept the world turning. Their stories were rarely written down, but their footprints remain in the ancient furrows of forgotten fields, in the ruins of village churches, and in the bones of the land itself. So next time you picture medieval life, don't just imagine swords and thrones. Picture the muddy boots, the tired hands, the silent prayers whispered in candlelight. This was the daily life of a medieval peasant. Hard, humble, and deeply human.